Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jen and this is Jen Restyle and Fashion. And over here, I take thrifted items and I restyle them and create something new. And I also take my new pieces and I restyle them with my thrifted pieces to create a wardrobe that fits my own unique style, and I hope to help you develop that as well. So this week we're starting out with a suit that a girlfriend of mine gave me. Her husband was getting rid of some suits, and so we're gonna restyle it into something really fabulous. Stay tuned. All right, the first thing we want to do is take the pants and seam rip them. What I did was I seam ripped both legs apart, and some of the area seam ripping was a little difficult, so I ended up having to cut it because I ripped into the fabric with the seam ripper. The fabric on these pants was super thin, and so it ended up being easier to go in and cut, and sometimes that's what you have to do. I like to seam rip because it gives me that much extra fabric, but sometimes you just can't do it. Now, also with these pants, they had a cuff. So you know what that means? That gives you about almost 2 to 3 inches more in length. As you're beginning to seam rip, you definitely want to try to take advantage of as much of the fabric as possible when making this piece, because what we're doing is we're trying to create a kind of a shawl, like a narrow shawl that's going to go across the shoulder. And so we want to utilize as much of the fabric as possible. So in addition to seam ripping everything, you're also going to press it. So once you have, if the pants that you have, have a cuff, make sure you remove that. And then you want to press this as nice and flat and smooth as possible. All right, so I only separated the one leg from the opposite leg first because I was hoping to keep the width as much as possible and still be able to get the length that I needed. I needed something that was going to be able to drape over the shoulder nicely and hang down over the arm. So the next step here is to put both pants legs together from the top and see if they can get matched up to create this long kind of scarf, if you will. I know I said you're going to throw it over the shoulder, but it really is a scarf that goes, it can be wrapped around the neck or the head or just tucked in. It can be tied, it can be pinned, all different things like that. And so I took a little time to kind of play around with the fabric, and I want you to do this too, because you might find that some other ways work out better. In the end, I took the two pants legs, laid them on top of each other, and then I ended up at the widest part stitching that together. So you can see here how I'm laying it out, and I'm looking to see how long this is going to be, if it's going to be wide enough. Now you are going to lose some fabric in this because obviously the pants aren't even. If you can do this project with a pair of pants that are straight leg, you are going to have a much easier time. But these particular pants were tapered towards the end, so that meant that the widest it was going to be was the bottom of the pants leg. So I folded it over so that I could trim off the excess and make sure that it matched the same width as the bottom of the pants leg. And so this is what I end up with. I can't remember if I remove the lining or not. I might have kept it in there because I felt like the lining gave it a little more stability. I'm not sure. We'll see as we go through the video. But you see here, I'm trimming off the excess fabric to make it even. And this is essentially going to be the full length of the scarf that is going to be attached to the jacket. That is really going to elevate this blazer, like beyond belief. All right, let's go back to the studio. All right, here we are. I've put the jacket on the mannequin, and now I have to create a hole. Now I've got to create a hole underneath the lapel. Now you want to put this hole inside the jacket, but underneath the lapel so that you can't see it. That's an important part. And you want to make sure that it's long enough and wide enough so that when the fabric goes through, it's not pulling. And so you might be inclined to make a smaller cut, but you see here, and I will zoom in for you. It was about, I would say 5 or 6 inches wide. I tested it out and the fabric went through there just fine. So now we're going to go back to the machine and we're going to sew these legs together and we're going to create this scarf. Now, as you see here, I am stitching down the side. I've already attached them together in the middle and press that seam open. And now I'm just stitching all the way down the side. And then I flipped it over and I sewed from the other end. I think I need to make some adjustments in my feed dogs because I feel like the fabric on the bottom is always pulling more than the fabric on the top. So I probably need an adjustment. If you find that you're having that problem at home, definitely take your machine in or have somebody take a look at it because it should not be doing that. All right, so we are sewing everything closed. And I just met up with the stitch that I'd finished from the other end. And now we're just gonna turn this inside out. We're gonna press it and I'm gonna show you how to connect it to the jacket. Okay, now here's the fun part. So I took the raw edge that was basically unfinished. So when I turned it inside out, obviously one edge was closed and the other one wasn't. I took the raw edge and I pinned it just underneath the lapel on the left side. Then I took the remaining fabric and stuck it through the hole that I created. And just kind of playing around with the tie. There's so many options with this. You can get so many different looks with this jacket. I mean, I just love it. I think this is not only an easy upcycle for a beginner or intermediate, but it's also a great way to style a jacket. If you have a long scarf, you can also try it with a long scarf. I ended up adding a little boutonniere that I made out of some ties, and I was matching it up with this purse, trying to figure out which handbag would be best with it because this was going into a show. All right, so let's go back to the machine and let's stitch down this the scarf. So I took the raw edge and I pinned it, like I said, underneath the lapel and pinned it in place. I had to move it over just a little bit because I wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to be seen, and that's really important. You don't want those stitches being seen on the outside, so make sure you make whatever adjustments so that it's not showing. And I apologize, you guys, I have been suffering from a cold or something, and so my voice keeps going in and out. All right, so you're going to go in, stitch that down. Now you need to switch over to the hole that you've created. And we don't want to just leave a raw hole in our jacket because it will start to fray and those little pieces will start to get on your clothes. We don't want that. So what I did, I went in with seam binding and I basically seam binded that opening so that even if somebody pulled the collar up and they saw the hole, they would see that it was a finished hole. You know, they might think it was a pocket or whatever, but it just gives a nice finished look to your garment. All right, and then, you know, we have to give it a little extra zhuzh. I mean, the scarf is definitely fabulous, but let's see what else we can do to elevate this upcycle jacket. All right, so the same thing that I do in all of my Blazer upcycles, if I'm ever going to cut down the center or cut it in half or whatever, I always stabilize the fabric and the lining. So you saw me go in and just pin on both sides of the area that I'm planning to cut. And this way I don't have to worry about the lining moving around and just worrying about all of that. Don't have to worry about that at all. So I cut this jacket right up the middle. There was a back seam, so that made it super easy. And then I went in with my seam binding, and the seam binding was brown, and so I thought that was a nice contrast to the taupish color jacket that it was. I put the seam binding on both raw edges. Actually, correction, I think I only put the seam binding on one, because once I put the seam binding on, then we went and we sewed it together, and the only part you're going to see is the one that has the seam binding. So I'll zoom in here just a little bit so that you can see how I'm pulling this together. Seam binding has been such a great notion for me in sewing, especially in upcycles, because sometimes these fabrics are so thick and heavy that you can't necessarily put them in a serger, and sometimes that just makes it so much easier to put seam binding on it. So I did put seam binding on both sides, even though we overlapped it. You know, what I had thought initially was that I was going to actually make buttonholes and sew buttons on and then have this open up so that the jacket would open in the back, and it's still a possibility, but we might save that for another day. So I went through my big old bag of buttons, and you guys know this is the bag of buttons that I go to all the time when I'm creating something and I want to give it kind of that vintage flair. This bag of buttons was my mother's. My mother sewed all my life, and she collected buttons from old clothes and just things that she would find. And I'm keeping that legacy alive by utilizing those buttons and adding to. So whenever I find different buttons, I add to my bag of buttons. All right, now we are back at the sewing machine, and we are going to attach this seam binding to the raw edges. I like to cut the seam binding on an angle and then fold it and tuck it and then sew it down. That gives a nice clean finish. You guys have seen me do this before in several other videos, but just in case, I am zooming in so that you can see it a little better. Now we're just going to sew straight down on top of the seam binding. I think I'm using like a brown or goldish kind of thread. I don't always subscribe to, you know, my thread absolutely matching unless it has to. I kind of like to give a contrast sometimes. I just think it gives a really interesting look. One of the things I want you to make sure that you're doing when you're sewing this seam binding on is making sure that you're capturing the fabric as well as the lining underneath. The lining has a tendency to slide around, and what you don't want to do is you don't want to have to go back and take the seam binding off, take the stitches out, and re-sew it. We don't want to do that. So make sure you're looking at the opposite side and making sure that it's all connected. And mine is very nice, clean finish. All right, so now we are reattaching the rear of the jacket. This is helpful because the jacket was super oversized, and even though I want an oversized slouchy look to the jacket, I still want it to look like it is made for a woman's figure. So I went in, and as you can see again, I had to stop midway and flip the jacket around and stitch because my feed dogs were making it uneven. But as you can see, it turned out just fine. But I wanted to make it a little more fitted so that it really looked like it was, tailor-made. So I went in with my, I measured the distance of the buttons down the back, and I placed them, and I just hand sewed each one of the buttons down. Again, this is a feature that I added because I just wanted to elevate the look even more, and I thought this was a nice touch. You can use larger buttons. You can actually make it so that it opens and closes. I'm just here for inspiration, and I hope that you guys take this inspiration and build on it and create something absolutely beautiful and magical. All right, guys, well, that is it. I'm sewing on the last button, and right after this video, the next day was the show, and this was a little footage from backstage in the dressing room, the model with the jacket on. I think that it turned out really fabulous. I hope some of you will try this out, and if you do, please drop me an email. My email is in the description box below. In the December month, I am going to be highlighting some of you guys' projects, and I would love to show how you guys put this together. All right, you guys, see you in the next video. Bye.